Miss Brenda Evans. Her story is Under a Bright White Moon.
It was the winter of 1983. I was 22 years old, and there I was, in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the night, under a bright white moon. It was a journey that started about 4 months earlier, what put me here with my best friend Becky and I boarded a plane from Los Angeles to London. We decided about 1 year earlier that we would take a year after college to travel and see the world. So planning for this trip was pretty loose, but we knew for sure that we would go to Egypt because the pyramids were a must-see. So after 4 months of hitchhiking, trains and ferries and buses, we found ourselves across the road from the main train station in Cairo. Now, it's one thing to think you might be prepared for Cairo because you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it is another one entirely to be standing there yourself amidst the visceral experience that is the bright white sun and the dirt and the exhaust and the heat and the people everywhere. So we need to get to the train station across this road, and I don't know how far it was, but it felt like an ocean. And it was an ocean teeming with people and cars and buses and motorcycles and donkeys and bicycles. And there were horns honking and donkeys braying and people shouting, and it was chaos. And it was just packed. And I'm sure they must have had some sort of traffic laws there, but there's absolutely no evidence. There are no lines on the streets, there's no stop signs. There's intersections, but you can't tell which way anything is supposed to be going. It's crazy, but it all works for them somehow. We stood there for I don't know how long before we mustered up the courage to cross the road, but cross it we did. And we found ourselves in a really beautiful train station, quite lovely. We needed a little rest before tackling the next adventure, which was buying a ticket in a station full of people and all in Arabic. That was another little ocean to cross. Before we took that on, you know, the inside of the train station was so nice and peaceful, and we found some chairs and we just flopped out on those and we're like, we'll just sit here for a little while until the moment strikes us, and we'll go get some tickets. So while we're flopped out there, we're sitting there and we're just relaxing, and I hear in the distance, I'm like, what is that? And I'm nudging my friend Becky and I'm like, do you hear that? It sounds like Americans. And she's like, I do, I hear it. And it's getting closer and it's closer. And then a few minutes later, we are surrounded by, I don't know, maybe 12, 15 middle-aged women from Georgia. And they're like, do you speak English? Do you mind if we join you? Can we sit here? Is it all right? And we're like, heck yeah, join us. Come on, come on. And they're like, what are you guys doing? And all this exchange. And they were on a tour of Egypt together. And their tour group leader was our savior. And his name was Ali Ashur El Gabri. So we had told the ladies a little bit about our story crossing the street and how we needed to tackle the tickets and so forth. And when Ali showed up, they're like, Ali, you need to help these girls. These girls need your help. Now you do what you can for them. And we're like, yeah, that would be awesome. And did he ever? So, you know, we had an immediate rapport with him. He was middle-aged, and he was smart, and he was engaging and genuine and witty, and he had connections at the station. Of course. So he hooked us right up with our overnight train to Luxor, and he sent us on our way with all of his contact information and with strict instructions that we were to get in touch with him when we came back to Cairo, which we did when we returned 3 weeks later. So while we were getting caught up with Ali after we'd returned to Cairo about all of our adventures in Luxor, and we mentioned that we wanted to head up to Alexandria. And he's like, oh, well, you know, I have a good friend who owns a house up in Alexandria. Let me give him a call. And we're like, oh, okay, you know. And so he does, and as it happens, his friend, Ahmed, was going up to Alexandria the next day, and he'd be happy to take us with him and host us for a few days. And we're like, that's amazing. That's fantastic. And so his friend Abubakar was going to be going with him too. Now, Ahmed was middle-aged man like Ali, and he was very sophisticated and erudite. He was a pilot for Olympic Airlines. And his friend Abubakar was about our age, maybe a little bit over, and kind of a, if you can imagine, Egyptian hippie, you know. And so go figure, these two were friends. We're like, but that was great. So off we go to Alexandria in Ahmed's Mercedes sedan for a 3-hour drive, and we're having a great time talking and everything. Ahmed spoke impeccable English, but Abubakar didn't speak any. He nodded a lot, and it was all fine. Smiles all around. Anyway, we drive up there, and we arrive at this lovely house with a spacious room for us with 2 beds and these French doors opening out into a beautiful garden. And we're like, God, this just couldn't even be better. I mean, how lucky are we to have met Ali, and he's got this friend. It's just all, you know, so serendipitous. So we cooked dinner that night, and we ate outside in the garden as the sun was setting, and the nearly full moon was starting to rise, and it was just like a dream, and we couldn't have felt any more fortunate or lucky than we were. And after dinner, we walked into town to this small bar. And you may be thinking, a bar in Egypt? Well, I don't know now, but back in '83, it was pretty unusual. But this was a special bar because it was really for foreigners, particularly foreign men, mostly from Britain, who were in Egypt working on the offshore platforms, the oil rigs. And so we, of course, we were allowed in because we were Western women. Local women would not have even contemplated going into such a place. But we had no problem, and we were, as you might imagine, big hit in this bar. They're like, oh my God, we haven't seen Western women in 6 months, let alone talk to them and had a drink with them. And we're like, oh, awesome, we'll take it easy. It's okay, we're all here to have a good time. And they were so charming and funny in their kind of desperation to just talk to and look at us, let alone, like, you know, touch our hand, like, oh my gosh. And we had a great time. You know, we were all laughing and drinking and, you know, just having a great old time. We closed the place down, and Becky and Ahmed and Abubakar and I walked, you know, back to the house and went to bed. And the next day we get up, and it was a glorious sunny day, and we lounged about reading and chatting and relaxing, and went through the same thing, dinner, you know, outside, lovely. Went back to the bar that night. We were all having a great time again. Oh, it's so great to see you again. Yay, so happy you're here. And we're like, yeah. But Ahmed was not quite as buoyant as he was the night before. He's a little moodier. We're like, oh, well, you know, I don't know. He's entitled to be in a mood. Until he abruptly announced that we needed to go home. We need to leave. And we're like, oh, well, okay. All right, so farewells all around and see you later and all that good stuff. And so we walked back, and it was a very quiet walk, and we get back to the house, and like, that's kind of weird. And then he announces that we were going back to Cairo. We're like a little surprised. It was late, and Cairo was a 3-hour drive away. So we're like, well, you know, okay, how are we going to argue? So we packed up all our stuff, and we loaded it into the car, and we hit the road. And the atmosphere in the car was a bit tense, and it got more and more tense the farther we drove, until he pulled over and said he wasn't going to Cairo after all. He was going back to his place in Alexandria. We're like, well, okay. But no. Becky and I wouldn't be going back unless we were friendlier. So over the course of my and Becky's previous months of travel together, the role of diplomat and problem solver had fallen on my shoulders. So Becky and I are in the back seat, and she's poking my leg, and she's mouthing at me, do something, and I'm just like, okay, and I'm like, what do you mean friendlier? Like, how have we not been friendly? What are you talking about? And he looks back at me, and he's like, you know what I mean. Yeah. We knew what he meant, but all I could think of to say was, well, this is as friendly as we get. And then he said, well, unless we were friendlier, we wouldn't be going back to Alexandria with him. So he's laying down ultimatums, and Becky's poking me in the leg, and I'm like, I guess we'll get out here then. Now, he'd let us out or he wouldn't. But he said, I guess you will. So he and Becky and I got out of the car. He opened the trunk. We grabbed our bags. He got back in the car, and they drove away. So there we were, two 22-year-old women from California on the side of the road in the middle of the desert in the middle of the night in Egypt. If it weren't for the situation, it would have been sublime. I mean, it was gorgeous outside. It was a beautiful night, the cobalt black sky. It was so quiet and it was calm under that bright white moon. Quiet and calm, but for the two of us. We were so disgusted and so outraged. I mean, we were pissed at how he had just treated us. And we might have been more concerned about this new predicament we were in. I mean, we were miles away from anything in either direction. And I mean, in the middle of nowhere, just the pavement disappearing on the horizon in both directions. And we were still so angry and outraged about our situation that we didn't have time to consider what we were going to do next when a car's headlights appeared on the horizon. There really wasn't anything to do besides stand there and watch as those headlights drew nearer and then stopped. There were two men inside, maybe in their 30s or so. They spoke enough English to understand our situation, and they offered us a ride back to Alexandria. And we're like, well, that's great. We couldn't think of anywhere else to go except to the bar where we had been. They knew of it, and they agreed to take us there. Well, I can tell you we did turn some heads when we walked back into that bar that night without Ahmed and Abubakar. And we made sure they all knew the reason why. They were almost as disgusted and outraged as we were, and we had all kinds of offers of places to crash for the night, and everybody was so sorry, and they couldn't do enough for us, and so we gratefully accepted the room on a floor of one of our barmaid's friends. The next morning, we took a train back to Cairo, and Ali picked us up at the station, and he was appalled by his friend's behavior, and he couldn't apologize enough. But we were unharmed, and of course we did not blame him. I mean, it wasn't his fault. He thought he knew this guy. And he took us to his Bedouin tent compound near Giza. I mean, it was all part of his tour business where he hosted all his tour groups and everything. And we all flopped out on pillows, and we were eating and drinking and talking and laughing and having a thoroughly enjoyable time into the night. Becky and I were a little bit sheepish about not having actually been to the pyramids after being in Egypt for 6 weeks and having to leave pretty soon. And it was about that time that Ali, beckoned us over to the door of the tent. And he's like, come here for a second. And we're like, oh, okay. And we get up, and he's like, have a look at this. And we looked out the door, and it was darkness, and then the lights came up on the pyramids. And they were just right over there. And we're like, what? Oh my God, like, how did you do that? What did you do? I mean, it was amazing. And they were just spectacular. Right there, and it was fantastic. Now, we had been driven to his compound at night, and so we had no idea where the pyramids were in relation to this. So it was really quite a special moment, and I'll never forget it. And other things I won't forget is that when I think back on my travels in Egypt, it's never lost on me how lucky we were that night, and so many other times in the year that we traveled together. And some people might say that we should never allow ourselves to get into that situation with Ahmed. But what situation was it exactly that we shouldn't have allowed? Should we not have trusted men to be decent? Or trusted men to know the true character of their friends? Or trusted in the face value of how a man presents himself? I'd had many, many interactions with many different men in Egypt. And save for that one man, all of them were kind, decent, generous, and helpful. And so I'd like to tip my hat to all of those men. And although I may have become a little more cautious because of one man's behavior, it's because of all of the others that I continued to take people at face value until evidence, gave me some reason to believe I should do otherwise. Now, my memories of Egypt are so overwhelmingly positive that this incident never tarnished them. A wonderful and decent man, Ali, came to our aid at the beginning and again at the end. And he topped it off with a singularly magical send-off the night we left. We had a late night flight, and Ali arranged for a taxi to take us to the airport. And we bid him a thankful and tearful farewell and waved goodbye as our taxi drove away. But it didn't take us to the airport. Nope. Ali had secretly arranged for the taxi driver to take us to the pyramids. So there we were, right up on top of the pyramids, all lit up like the night we'd seen him in the tent, traipsing around, unfettered and by ourselves in the moonlight. And they were, stunning. And if you can ever use this word, this would be the time. They were awesome. The pyramids at Giza, they're a great wonder of the world. And that is what I choose to think about when I think of myself in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the night, under a bright white moon.